Education is preparation for reparations.
Today I'm going to be talking about financial transaction taxes. They've been in the news recently. The President of Colombia, the President of Kenya have spoken about the need for a global financial transaction tax. They obviously haven't talked about it within the context of reparative justice or system change, but talked about it in the context of liberal reforms needed for a more just world. But I think we can do better here, making sure that we have the narrative from the grassroots about understanding the financial system, the legacy from slavery and colonialism, and how it continues to reproduce violence on an international scale. I'll be talking about campaigns that exist for an FTT, and I'll be talking about what we can do to make sure that we own the narrative for the FTT, not the industrial NGO complex.
This is an inaugural event of the Ubuntusumakikigaidze series. This is the introductory session, the first of many series to come, which has been described as a whole new dynamic breakthrough of planet repair's organic, revolutionary, intellectual, peace, guerrilla, scholar activism. This is being brought together by the Extinction Rebellion being the Change Affinity Network in conjunction with XRISN, the International Solidarity Network. It's an important time for us to shift now the narrative towards the grassroots information that is coming out of progressive movements. It's coming out of the intergenerational struggles of colonized communities of resistance. And so with that, it's important that we're able to shift now towards a serious discussion for decolonization. And it's for that reason that this has been titled Ubuntusumakikigaidze, which combines Ubuntu, the Bantu term from Southern Africa, which really deals in this concept of a shared humanity. Sumac, which is a Quechua term from the indigenous communities of Abya, which refers to a fulfillment of how we should be engaging with Mother Earth or planet Earth. Ikigai from Japan, and it's a Japanese term which means an intimate conversation. And Je from the Betowa indigenous nation, which, I tell a lie, is an intimate conversation. And Ikigai from Japan, which is actually a life of fulfillment. And so these terms coming together are about how we bringing our grassroots knowledges as communities to come together, sharing that knowledge, but also understanding the humility of the time that we're in, which requires a truth quest. It requires us to engage critically with ideas and own these ideas so that we can see how we can actually build knowledge and build power within our communities, because that is the movement that we are seeking to build. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Keval Bharadia, who is an anti-imperialist, heterodox political economist and activist, working with a range of radical groups resisting capitalism, fascism and racism, and building solidarity necessary for global justice. His research focuses on interrogating the colonial £12 trillion a day global commodity and financial markets used by the world's richest and most powerful people. I'll say that again. His research focuses on interrogating the colonial £12 trillion a day global commodity and financial markets used by the world's richest and most powerful people. And some of his work can be found at revolutionaryreparations.org. And the title of this session will be is titled Winning Planet Repairs by Revolution or Reform. And I'll let our brother Keval introduce himself and what he makes of the title. This series will start with an introduction of his work and his framing, followed by a Q&A intimate discussion, and then a closing conclusion from Keval.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you, Kobina. I hope to do justice to the scale of the task that we have to do here today. And hopefully this is just a humble interjection that I'm making here today based on my experiences and my knowledge. It was actually about 3 years ago, I think I had a conversation with Esther and Kofi, talking to them about the impact that a financial transaction tax could have. I was in Indonesia at the time, and I was talking about it, and Esther and Kofi were critically engaging with it, and they said, "So this is about power." And then it was at that moment that I think it shifted in my head that absolutely this is about power and how we can use existing liberal reforms and translate that into systemic issues. How we can make that, how we can upscale those liberal reforms and make systemic change. Before that, in 2018, I was working in international development. I've been working in international development for the late 2010s, and I was at that time working for the big NGO Christian Aid, which has a budget of about £100 million a year. And there was a woman of African heritage that came to become the chief executive, Amokwandoh, and she held the first forum of all of the staff members, and she said, what are the radical ideas out there? Let me know. So I put my hand up at the back, and I was actually just a consultant for Christian Aid at the time, responsible for their private sector analysis. So I said, what's our view on reparations? And this was before George Floyd, and all of that. And she's like, yeah, we can perhaps think about that in due course. And we went away, and I produced a few papers for her and introduced the team to your work, Esther's work, Kofi's work. And Priya was at Christian Aid. She came back from maternity leave, and I met her. And at this time, I was making too much noise within Christian Aid about the limitations of their work and trying to make sense of how their salaries depend on them not knowing certain truths about the origins of the world that we live in today, where poverty, inequality, racism comes from. What are the real legacies of slavery and colonialism? To what extent did that process never end, but morphed into something different called capitalism and imperialism? And Priya gladly took on this work as I was booted out of Christian Aid, and then went to work for Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, where he introduced a UK radical financial transaction tax as part of the 2019 manifesto, the most radical globally that's been proposed in Parliament. Before that, for 5 years, I was helping to run NGOs and children's charities in India and Nepal. And that was immediately after a career that I had working at the London Stock Exchange for 15 years, which I did. In a way, it made me understand how inequality around the world is manifested through the financial system. And we're very much naive to understanding economics because we know, the work that Prela is doing, that we're not taught truly what economics should be. We're taught what the colonizers want us to believe about what economics is and how the financial markets and capitalism generates prosperity for all and development, and obviously that has no impact, right? That's what we're led to believe. And it took a while. It took a while for me to realize this is all nonsense, and I quit in protest, giving up a very lucrative job to now be almost penniless in trying to kind of help grassroots movements understand the financial system and the scale of policy reform within there that can be repurposed for revolutionary purposes. And that's where this work has come out from. So today I'm going to be talking about the financial transaction tax and how I think it can contribute to reparatory justice and system change. To begin with, I've just got a slide up here that says I'm going to be covering about 6 different areas. The first 4 give an overview of what I think is the financial system as a whole. The 4 areas that we really need to get to grips with. The first is commodities trading, the commodities market, which, if you can imagine anything around the world that is plundered, mined, extracted, it doesn't just end up on our supermarkets shelves. It doesn't just end up in our petrol tanks. It goes through the machinery of the financial system because it's the finance sector that's bankrolled all of that violence in the first place. So I'll be talking and breaking down the commodities market. Then I'll be talking about what people mostly can know about, like when I say financial markets, For them, it's, okay, stock trading. And actually, that's a fairly small component of the financial system. And I'll be talking about why the stock market really is a representation of our future exploitation that's already guaranteed. And I'll be breaking that down as well. Third, I'll be talking about how the trading of currencies by the big Western imperial powers is a site of key economic imperialism. And lastly, I'll be talking about the fixed income market, which is a fancy word for things like loans, debts, and credit products. Those are the four pieces of the financial markets that I'll be talking about, and how a tax on the trading of those markets really can get to the heart of capitalism and imperialism. And I'll finish with two areas: the campaign for financial transaction taxes. So I'll be bringing everyone up to date about where these campaigns exist at the moment, predominantly, obviously, in liberal spaces. But hopefully, we have an opportunity to reclaim the narrative on the title of this talk being, the revolutionary use of reform. Is what would that look like if we took ownership of the NGO narrative for financial transaction taxes? And what would that look like, given that it really is a tax on the center of financial capitalism, the center of financial imperialism? And lastly, I'll be talking about how that obviously feeds into planet repairs. So to begin with, every day, around $150 trillion or 120 billion pounds worth of trading per day, on average, flows through these commodity markets. So all of the things that are plundered out of the earth on stolen land, let's not forget, gets traded through the financial system before it then becomes, refined into oil and gas, before it becomes gold in our, on our rings or necklaces, and silver, lithium, all of the new minerals that we need now to run the green revolution out of the world. They all get channeled into the financial system. People are making trades on this. And it's important to remember that these markets originated in this form, in this global form, only from the dawn of slavery and colonialism, the 1500s. They didn't exist on a global scale before that moment. The key thing about the commodities market that most people who advocate for the FTT don't link is the extent to which the commodities market drives imperialism. So think about what happened in the war in Iraq, which we know was a proxy war for oil. There were no weapons of mass destruction. We know that. But after the war, 10 years after the war, in the mid-2010s, BP and Shell were operating in Iraq, producing and barreling up more barrels of oil there than they were in the whole of the North Sea. A key site of imperialism created through the commodities market. And the reason why that's interesting is because these organizations, BP and Shell, are not just causing the cost of living crisis now, right, by greedflation. They internally have huge numbers of traders themselves. So they're operating like a bank. They're doing their own speculating on oil and gas. And we know that their profits have been huge, like 20 to 30 billion pounds a year, their profits. But the same amount of profits that they have is the size of their portfolios that they have in oil and gas markets. It's very easy then for a cartel of these European oil and gas companies to dominate the price landscape globally for what should be the price of oil and gas. So that idea that companies now have become trading houses, we don't longer have companies generally producing things anymore because we don't need to, right? The world is abundantly full of things that have been manufactured and made. So what they're doing now is using colonial money that they've built up for centuries and just trading on the financial markets. And that process is called financialization and is a key key issue that drives our analysis on like what's the future economy looking like, and it's basically this moneyed economy. It's not an economy where you're producing things anymore. Yeah. And I think the last point, speaks for itself, is that in order for these commodities to be taken out of the ground, they've always relied upon a history of not just state violence, outward state violence, but subversive state violence. For example, through paramilitaries who are guarding mines in the global south, so that private companies can plunder. So there is a direct connection between what we think as Western governments, who are, democratic and progressive, and them allowing the plunder of these resources, knowing that there are paramilitary forces protecting these mines from activists and campaigners, many of whom have lost their lives, as we know, around the global south, protecting indigenous forests, indigenous lands. Yeah, so that's the commodities market. And here is an interesting slide. This is a slide where I've taken a screenshot of the global exchange for gold and silver. So the gold and silver exchange for the world is in London. Yeah, it's called the London Bullion Market Association, the LBMA. And there, the gold and silver mined out of the earth all gets traded in London, right? A clear example of like the colonial legacy of the precious metals market. And they have this interesting page where they go through the history of their organization and quite proudly talk about, how the guinea, that was a coin minted here in the UK, comes from Guinea, the country, which is here at the bottom of that. And they don't see the violence, the epistemic violence that has on our bodies. The body keeps score, right, of that trauma. But from when it comes to business and finance, as usual, it's openly out there, the connections that Western organizations have to the plunder of the planet, and put it as part of their history in a very proud way. Which, what does that do to our bodies? It generates trauma, intergenerational trauma, and that's just the gold and silver market is in London. Well, this is the London Metal Exchange, a picture of the trading floor, where mostly people of a similar heritage and similar sex sit around this ring, and at very specific times of the hour get up to trade global iron production and other industrial metals, right? Including metals and minerals that are going to be used in the production of, for example, batteries. Right? It's still in London. These organizations are, and they're proud to be in London, absolutely proud to be in London, a clear colonial legacy. And actually, I think the London Metal Exchange used to run tours of the trading floor, and I believe that they've been cancelled. But it's interesting if you want to go and check out the London Metal Exchange and all the other exchanges in London, of which there are plenty. It's important to kind of go there and see the disconnect that they have with the world in terms of global poverty and inequality and extraction, versus what they think is creating a market where the global players can, move all of these commodities around so that, it exists in the countries that it needs to exist in. And here's just another example of a US-based exchange. This is called the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And this Chicago Mercantile Exchange is... The acronym is CME, so they go by the CME. But the language that they use in their websites, is focusing on capitalize on our culture of innovation. It talks about it presents this idea that anyone can participate in these markets and make money. It very much normalizes capital accumulation without connecting it with the resources, the plundered resources that sit behind the trading activity on these exchanges. And also, again, on their history page, very proudly, starting being formed in the 1800s. Yeah, very proudly. At that time, it was called the Chicago Board of Trade. So we have here very, very powerful institutions, very, very powerful, at the center of capitalism, that are responsible for organizing the global marketplace for commodities trading. Yeah? The second market, which are not going to be as long as the commodities market explanation, is what we commonly know as the financial markets, which people have most familiarity with, which is stock trading. Buying shares of particular companies like BP or Shell, for example. But it's interesting to remember that the origins of stock markets come from slavery and colonialism, created to finance imperial plunder, to finance slave ships, to finance sea voyages from as early as the late 1500s, actually. But the Amsterdam Stock Exchange being the first to formalize the stock exchange, what's the first company that lists? The Dutch East India Company. Yeah? So, which is where the general population, obviously rich people in the Netherlands at that time, could own shares in global plunder, global slavery, global exploitation, global blood. Yeah? And it continues to this day. Amsterdam Stock Exchange is very, very big. The London Stock Exchange is very big. Paris Stock Exchange is very big. And obviously New York is very big. Interestingly, the London Stock Exchange was the first to introduce a financial transaction tax. But what did it want? Why did it introduce an FTT, a financial transactions tax? It was to raise money off rich elites to give to the crown, so the crown could go to war. Yeah, with at the time France, but the word stamp duty still exists today. So if you buy a house, you have to pay stamp duty, and that process basically means, in order for that certificate to be legally enforceable, you have to take a bit of official ink and stamp the document, and that's the duty of paying that stamp for it to be enforceable. Becomes the contract becomes enforceable at that point. Yeah. And what we're doing is saying, okay, from our grassroots perspective, if we were to own the narrative of a financial transaction tax, a stamp duty, and ramp it up and create a mass campaign around it, what would that look like? Which is what I get to in this presentation. The third bullet point here is what are share prices? And I think this is really a misunderstood concept, especially for someone who's kind of trained in a kind of neoclassical economic ideology. So share prices generally tend to be, so share prices go up, indices go up, the FTSE 100, the Dow Jones is going up. What does that mean? People think, boats are rising, a rising tide, everyone's going to do well. Right? But if you go beneath that, what analysts in the city, very clever people sitting in front of screens, what they're analyzing is how a company, BP or Shell, is going to perform in the future. So is it going to be competitive? Is it going to have access to these oil and gas markets? Is Amazon or any other company, going to have access to, for example, cheap labor, right? Is it going to be profitable? So what share prices represent in many ways is the guarantee of future exploitation. Right? So a lot of people think it's kind of a benign aspect. It's we're all going to do well. But no, that's absolutely not that. I don't own any shares, and most people don't own shares in anything. But if they did, what they're participating in, unbeknown to many people, is the continuation of capitalism and imperialism, which we know is exploitative, which we know fundamentally is driven on racism and violence. Right? What is even more interesting about that is then what does a finance industry do when it's banking on future profits? Yeah? It will start then lobbying governments to make sure that legislation is in place to suppress wages, right? To make sure, subtly, that you have right-wing authoritarian regimes that will go to war in order to make sure they have access to land, to resources, to commodities, to cheap labor. Right? It's almost like the formalization and the legalization of the system that started from the 1500s, and now they legalize it and they call it capitalism and imperialism, and it's widespread throughout society. So much so that people's pensions are obviously, based on the stock market. So people are very nervous, right? Oh, what does this mean to my pensions? Well, actually, one, you're very privileged if you have a state or if you have a private pension compared to the mass of the global population, right? Whose insurance policies are their children, right? That's why Asian families are so big, right? We're there making sure that we look after our elders. And it's the same for other communities. But in Western liberalese, it's no, we don't need to worry about that. We're just going to make sure that we can plunder, have our pensions, and have this whole system created to keep trickling into our bank accounts after we don't even need to work. The one way to remember how important the financial system is to global imperialism and capitalism is to remember what happened in 2019 when we were close to getting a social democratic government or a socialist government, depending on your take on Jeremy Corbyn, which was at the time the UK military general said that if he comes to power, there would be a mutiny. It's important to remember, keep that in our consciousness, that the establishment is very much against us having access to progressive political parties that can at least try and move the agenda forward. Yeah. Here's a screenshot of the London Stock Exchange's website, and I've highlighted a few words here that are interesting and we need to pay attention to. It says it's truly global. Yeah, the foundations that convene global capital for all businesses and investors. It's saying that it's at the epicenter of capitalism, right? And if that's our key site of resistance, then we have to pay attention to the London Stock Exchange and all exchanges. And it says there it's the custodians of global capital flows, yeah, which we know is the continuation of legalized plunder after slavery and colonialism. Right? And again, very proudly, their history begins. They want to say their history very much begins at the point at which Britain is a slave and colonial master. Very, very proud of that. Yeah. Again, not recognizing the epistemic violence and the violence on the body of seeing a process that we all suffered through and still suffer through from this day as being proudly, shown as their history. The third market that's important to pay attention to is the foreign currency markets. Yeah. So around the world, you have countries having different currencies. But those currencies, the valuation of those currencies, why currencies go up and down, is relative to the performance and the value of another currency. Right? So if you're a trader of a currency, you're always trading currency pairs. You're trading on one side US dollars in exchange for pounds, for example. Yeah. If you were to buy loads of pounds, the price might go up. If you were to sell loads of pounds, the price might go down. The majority of foreign currency trading in currencies denominated around the world comes out of Canary Wharf and the square mile. You have currency traders in London dominating the performance and the control of currencies here. So that means it's quite easy for traders in London, and the second big centre is New York, traders in Wall Street and traders in London, to be dominating and controlling what other currencies around the world should be. Right? So there isn't no free trade, right? The market doesn't settle organically to what's true, what's competitive, what's fair. It is dominated by a very visible hand, and that hand is Western imperialism, Western capitalism. Yeah. It's in, the third bullet point there talks about what happened in 1971. Since President Nixon's decision to suspend the US dollar convertibility to gold, we now have the creation of fiat currency. And it's a slightly technical issue, but we have to grasp this, which is that now, after 1971, countries can print money. Yeah? Before 1971, countries couldn't print money. They had to always have gold that they secured to that currency. So the more gold that they had, the more they could print the money, because their economy would expand. Which is why there was such a gold rush in America, yeah, on indigenous lands and in the global north. So what they did was okay, right, we're just going to peg everything to gold, suck all the gold out of the world. We could dominate the supply of money in the economy. But they were running out of gold in 1971. And in 1971, the US was at war with Vietnam and losing badly. So Nixon was like, okay, what are we going to do? We're going to forget gold as the standard to measure currencies. We're going to create this instrument or this process called fiat currency, F-I-A-T, which basically means we're going to now invent money at will by the clicks of a button, as long as it doesn't obviously create inflationary issues, which can easily be absolved by basically just hiding money into tax havens, which is what we know happens. There's about 40 to 50 trillion dollars worth of wealth hidden in tax havens, like the Cayman Islands, Barbados, Switzerland, Gibraltar, Jersey, and many more. London is a tax haven. So obviously, colonial islands acting as tax havens is a big part of this process. And it was at that time a Keynesian economist said, this is a bad idea. So even economists within that ideology, that liberal ideology, Keynesian ideology, said this is going to be a bad idea. Why don't we have a financial transaction tax just to slow down the production of all this money? And that guy was called James Tobin. And so you may have heard a financial transaction tax being referred to as a Tobin tax, and that comes from this economist saying in 1971, we think it's going to be a bit problematic if countries can just print as much money as they want. We need to slow it down. Yeah. And I already mentioned the fact that London, more than half the trading of currency markets is done out of London. I think I've already mentioned that. So who are the brokers? I've just given you 10 examples of the top 10 biggest brokers of currency around the world. Yeah. All obviously Western European and US organizations. Some you may know, some you don't know. But it's important to remember that the people who enable the plunder of our planet have names and addresses. Yeah? So the last market and the biggest market is the market for tradable debt, tradable loans. Yeah, it's called the fixed income market, and it's worth on average £6 trillion per day. Yeah? That's how much trading is going on in these markets. So corporate and government debt, governments would issue money, rather the central banks would issue money, and the governments would then take a loan out from the central bank. And a lot of people think that process is separate, but it's very much the government and the central bank acting together, acting as one, to further global capital. Yeah? These things can get repackaged and traded. So for example, mortgages, the thing that led to the 2008 crash was the trading of poor people's mortgages in the US, repackaged through the financial system, so people then could go and trade these on the financial market. Yeah? And it was the unraveling of these contracts in 2008 that led to the financial crash, where, as we know, no bank really was held accountable. No bankers were held accountable. The financial industry wasn't held accountable. Instead, what happened was global austerity, governments rolling back on social welfare, yeah? And at the same time bailing out these banks, giving license to these banks to carry on. Don't worry, here's some money. Don't go bankrupt. We will give you money. You carry on doing what you're going to do. Instead, we're going to get the public to pay back everything by crushing wages, austerity, cuts to social welfare. Yeah. I've put an example here of Elon Musk. And this kind of gives a practical example of how someone like Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, could use the fixed income market, the credit markets. Right? You're probably all familiar him buying Twitter recently, right? And he bought Twitter for £44 billion, right? But that £44 billion wasn't his money. He didn't take suitcases to 44 billion pounds and be around buying Twitter. What he did was like, okay, he went around to the banks and said, I'm gonna buy Twitter for 44 billion, but don't worry. As soon as I buy it, I'm going to make loads of debt on Twitter. So I'm going to make Twitter take out loads of loans, yeah, and from those loans, I'll pay you back. And that's called a leveraged buyout, right? So the financial system was acting with Elon Musk to be like, okay, so you're going to take out a loan from me and then pay me back to buy Twitter. It's a great deal. And that happens all the time, right? So capitalism is a process that's parasitic and it grows exponentially because of the process of financialization. That's a that's a very important topic for us to consider. But it goes even further, right? If you think about capital, think about wealth, where does it come from? It all is tainted with the blood of slavery and colonialism, right? And very specifically with Elon Musk, his family had emerald mines in Zambia, right? So he wasn't this genius that created Tesla and SpaceX and PayPal, right? His persona, his intelligence, all of that is a product of his privilege, yeah, and his position as someone taking wealth from the exploitation of Zambia through slavery and colonialism. Right? And that's how the system has always worked. It's always been parasitic from that process, which is why there is no global leveling up. Yeah, if any NGO says they're gonna solve equality without dismantling capitalism, they're lying to you. Right? So just to sum up, the total market in all of these trades that people are doing on the four markets, the commodities market, the stock trading market, the currency markets, and the fixed income market, is worth around 12 trillion a day. So what is that figure? You know, as I've tried to kind of say, that's what the figure demands of us in terms of our future bondage. Yeah, they want to make that money. Yeah, so all of their trading, they're trading all of these contracts, these imaginary pieces of paper, to the value of around $12 trillion per day. Right? So our exploitation in the future has already been guaranteed. Yeah, unless we're going to come to deal with this. Right? And as I said, 60 to 70% of all of that trading comes out of London and Wall Street. Right? In order to maintain profit levels, the system must subjugate and exploit and plunder. So this is what I'm saying here, is that the financial system creates the incentive to make sure that laws and policies are as they are, so that that money can be recouped in the future. Yeah, it's not the other way around. Who bankrolls governments? It's the financial industry. The biggest funder of the Tory party is the finance sector, right? And right-wing authoritarian regimes are all bankrolled by the finance sector. Yeah. And the last point, obviously, I don't need to expand on. The end of enslavement and colonialism did not free us. The system changed into capitalism and imperialism, and the value of that system is articulated through the financial markets. It is not articulated in total wealth. Yeah? Total wealth dwarfs the amount of trading that we have in the financial markets. It's much, much larger, right? So, coming to the financial transaction tax. Yeah? Obviously, I'm not the first person to talk about financial transaction taxes. It's important for us to remember that it has been used by Castro as a revolutionary use of reform in 2001. He talked about it at the anti-racist conference in Durban. Yeah? And he said, "May the tax suggested by Nobel Prize laureate James Tobin be imposed in a reasonable and effective way on the current speculative operations according for trillions of US dollars every 24 hours, then the UN, which cannot go on spending on meager, inadequate and belated donations and charities, will have 1 trillion US dollars annually to save and develop the world. Given the seriousness and urgency of the existing problems, which have become a real hazard for the very survival of our species on the planet, that is what would actually be needed before it is too late." Yeah? And after 2001, we did have campaigns, yeah? But they weren't our campaigns. They weren't revolutionary campaigns. Yeah? In 2001, the Robin Hood tax started. People like War on Want and Attack, which is a French organization, French NGO, set up to talk about a financial transaction tax that can go into aid, and others proposed the FTT. But again, the FTT didn't come from our perspective. It came from liberal Eurocentric perspectives. Yeah, it didn't come from the black radical tradition. There was no Pan-Africanism within it. There wasn't black Marxism within that. Even though these topics were popularized and many, many books by our revolutionaries were written at this point, but they weren't engaged in. You know, as we were talking about earlier, the NGO industrial complex, their salaries depend on them not engaging with this work in a revolutionary way. Yeah, but the FTT does exist around the world. As I said, in the UK, we have the stamp duty, yeah, on tax, and there's about 40 very small FTTs in operation around the world, raising about 40 billion pounds per year, which is nothing when you say, obviously, when I talk about the totality of the financial system, you know, which is 12 trillion pounds per day. Recently, there was a financial summit in Paris. It was about 3 weeks ago, and Macron hosted world leaders, and he was trying to bring world leaders together for them to pool their resources to try and do developmental work, make sure that we have growth, eradicate poverty, think about green energy. But thankfully, Petro and Ruto stood up and were like, how are we dealing with the financial system? Where is the financial transaction tax? Yeah? But it's important that we have the narrative on it, not other organizations that then dilute the message in here. Yeah? That we keep it revolutionary. Some work that we've done recently updates the numbers. 12 trillion pound a day number comes from analysis that I've done, and obviously it's $16 trillion per day. 12 trillion pounds is $16 trillion. A 1% tax on $16 trillion is 160 billion pounds per day. Right? 160 billion pounds per day could be raised by having a 1% tax. Yeah. What could international development organizations, even charities, liberal charities do, with $160 billion per day. But the thing is, a lot of them know that a financial transaction tax is revolutionary, but I've never said it out in these terms, right? But instead, what they do is spend a lot of time talking about, oh, we need a campaign for a Green New Deal, we need to do debt cancellation, we need to talk about, how do we eradicate racism, and all of these things tend to be disconnected from each other, without seeing the totality of our exploitation under capitalism, imperialism, right? And despite them having multi-million-pound budgets, what have they done to push a progressive political narrative where we even vote for left-wing or centre-left governments here in the UK or elsewhere? They haven't. We still have rampant and rising fascism on the back of NGOs doing this work for many, many years on huge budgets. And what did they do? They break all of our struggles down into so many different components, right? The list is never ending. Never ending. And there'll be other papers that will come out to be like, oh, we need funding for this, funding for that. And they don't connect up all of these struggles to be like, these are inseparable. Yeah? Solving one doesn't solve the rest of them, right? We don't need to break these down. In some ways, it's very similar to the way right-wing governments broke black and brown communities in the 90s from being unified under a politically black banner. Yeah? We used to act as one. We were black revolutionaries. Yeah? But no, race awareness training came in the 80s and 90s and said, no, you're Asian, you're Indian, you're Pakistani, you're Bangladeshi, you're Ghanaian, you're Jamaican, you're Kenyan. Who are your leaders? And we need you individually to step up and fight for resources so that you can start campaigning on your little bit. Yeah? Rather than people stepping back and being like, no, this issue is systemic. We need to act together as one. Yeah, we're never ending. So I'm hoping my humble suggestion is to try and move the FTT into more revolutionary spaces, yeah, where we own the narrative. And if we were to do that, it would start, I think, by making sure that we all understood the content of this presentation and more, and use the knowledge that is already out there by people in economics, yeah, and business and finance, and make sure that we understand the financial system, yeah, and create the connections with our movements around the world to see these commodities being plundered from these lands and realizing that they all get traded in London and Wall Street. Yeah? And we're not gonna solve that, those 100 lists of exploitation and subjugation alone. Let's connect up our struggles. And the FTT is a way that allows us to see the system as a whole, yeah, through those four markets. We can see what these people are up to. Yeah? If you had a 1% tax, yeah, you'd raise £160 billion per day. What would that do? Eradicate poverty, hunger, debt, homelessness, which we know are political choices, right? But that's the first step, I think, of reparative justice, is that we have some resources to try and help us deal with our pain and start healing, yeah? Instead of being indebted to the system, being forced into labor. Right? Start talking and speaking our truths, which we can't do, yeah? Because we're indebted and subjugated by the system constantly. Yeah? But don't stop at a 1% tax. Paint the picture and the utopian vision, actually, that if you were to sustainably bring down capitalism, how would you go about doing that? If you raise the tax up from 1%, you raise it higher and higher and higher. Obviously, you need progressive governments to do this. But if you were to do that, you slow down business and finance because you're making the cost of capital, which is the cost of banking and finance that they rely on, too expensive. Yeah, the loans that they take out, you're making the system unsustainable for them by raising the tax higher and higher and higher. And there reaches a tipping point when you start raising the tax up, you start drawing down their power. And it's only by drawing down their power can we start thinking about revolutionary reparations, which reparations have always been, in my view. Yeah. So just to sum up, the system was never broken. It was built this way. We have to keep telling the story that exploitation, racism, climate change are all part and inevitable under capitalism. They cannot be regulated. Yeah, no, they cannot be solved. We have to keep remembering and reminding people in all spaces that racism is intrinsic to capitalism. Yeah, the system literally cannot function without racism. It needs to have a racialized group of people on lower wages, exploited more, in order to run a system where you can make as much money as you want because land is now privatized. Yeah? How do we stop the global privatization of land? Yeah? We have to dismantle capitalism and imperialism. Right? We have to be free. I think for full reparatory justice, system change is absolutely part of that process. Because we are now tied to a system that is unsustainable, racialized, fascistic, patriarchal, and fundamentally driven through war and imperialism. Yeah? We know this. And interestingly, if you look at capitalism in that way, that it's a continuation of this violence on the body, yeah, the three UN principles could be argued to stand counter to capitalism. So if we want reparative justice through UN principles, we can actually say that, hang on, the process of exploitation didn't end after slavery. It continued through capitalism. So what we have here under UN principle of reparations of cessation, i.e. stopping, assurance of non-repetition, and restitution, that is incommensurate with capitalism. Yeah? It goes counter to capitalism. And we can repurpose even UN language, I think, in that way. The FTT stops the exploitation of people and planet. It can deliver reparative justice and system change, I think. It makes us understand the system as a whole and connects up our struggles around the world. If we were to do that and draw and tax the financial system, drawing down their power, that way I think we can have a chance of global peace, security, justice, equality, and sustainability. All of the things that we're working on. Yeah. And if we don't do this, right? If the FTT doesn't become legislation, at the very minimum, it will demonstrate the limitations of liberal governments, right? It will demonstrate the extent to which are we actually living in democracies? And I think that in itself is a useful process to go through in order to build allyship with people around the world. Yeah. So that's the last slide. Let's have a conversation about that. Thank you.
So thanks, Keval. So I'm going to really just pick up where you began in terms of recapping on the conversation that we had several years ago about power. And I guess my question to you, and what I'd like you to say a bit more about, is how can a financial transaction tax in the way that you've described actually become reality? And what are the challenges to that happening? Why don't we have it yet? And how can we enforce it?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? So this slide tries to speak a little bit about the practicality of doing this work. it's not popularized. So I think at the very beginning, let's have more of these conversations where we're popularizing the idea of a financial transaction tax in our own language of emancipation and liberation from capitalism and imperialism. And have these conversations with revolutionaries around the world at a global grassroots level. Yeah, I think we have the benefit of living in the belly of the beast, to see London, to see Wall Street, to see the financial system here operating. You know, we can stand and deliver these talks outside exchanges, outside banks, and popularizing and spreading that understanding. And I think the reason why it hasn't been done yet is because the revolutionary narrative has never been connected with an FTT. And I'm hoping that we can start doing that now, for the first time. Instead, as I was pointing out earlier, the narrative of the FTT hasn't been held by us. It never has. But now it's becoming popularized, especially after George Floyd and BLM, and people seeing that we need system change. The financial transaction tax is rising in people's consciousness. And then there is a danger of the narrative being ran with by the NGO industrial complex. So I think, and I'm totally up for working with you on doing this, making sure that we have and we hold a radical narrative that comes from our radical traditions, and start building that knowledge and growing that knowledge and making that widely understood with revolutionaries around the world. I think that's the first step. And saying that globally, there is an absolute practical policy that groups can say, we want this. So when Oxfam and Christian Aid go there and do liberal international development work to grassroots communities can respond and be like, hang on a minute, why are you coming here helping us with this? That's great, but you're in the belly of the beast. Why have we got a financial transaction tax? We can eradicate poverty tomorrow if you had a 1% tax on financial markets trading, the majority of which is done from where your offices are based, in London or Wall Street. That's what I think would be extremely powerful, if that message came from groups like us around the world to say, hang on a minute, there is a radical proposal on the table. There is a revolutionary use of reform on the table that's come from the grassroots for the first time ever. I think that's how, I think that could be one way that we start having these conversations and popularizing it and getting it to become reality. Getting liberal NGOs, getting people who want to be allies onto the page to be like, we have this narrative from our grassroots. How can you help us further this with all of their enormous resources that they have and control over, essentially, like instruments of propaganda? How can they help us do that?
Yeah, I guess as I'm listening to you, I'm also thinking about the theme around reform or revolution, and you've spoken about this in the context of the revolutionary use of reform. And it may not be clear to everyone, watching this presentation, why you're advocating this as a revolutionary approach or mechanism, a financial transaction tax. What is it that makes a financial transaction tax revolutionary, in your opinion? I guess you'd have to then say a bit about what is revolution, the meaning of revolution for you.
We've got a question from Devon. Who will collect and distribute the financial tax? Who will utilise the funds?
Yeah. Shall I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
So.
Recording in progress.
So here, is where I talk about how can we scale up the tax for it to become revolutionary. At small percentages, it's not revolutionary. It very much isn't, because business and finance will continue unabated. So our exploitation will continue, right? But if at that point we have enough progressive governments around the world who are part of us, who are listening to us, and allied with our movements, and then we start to become elevated into positions of power, if you raise the tax up from 1% to 2%, 5%, what you do is you make the cost of doing business too expensive. Right? You end up breaking capitalism from within. You're saying business and finance, who relies on the financial system for it to do all of this plunder, you make it too expensive for them to do this work if you were to raise up the tax. And then you start saying, okay, well, we're slowing down business and finance, you're slowing down business as usual. That then will have a bearing on how does that plunder continue, how are those militaries financed. You start to see weaknesses in their system, and because the financing of it has dropped, because it's the financing, it's the system, legalized plunder through capitalism. If we were to break that system, we have the chance of saying, okay, let's stop being bonded by it. If you raise the tax, and obviously you need progressive governments to do that.
Okay, and that probably leads on to, was it Devon's question?
Yes,
but just to pick up on, sorry. So it's reliant on us having progressive governments.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. All right, let me stop thinking about the
Okay,
people
so
in charge.
back to Devon's question
Yeah.
was who will collect and distribute the financial tax, and who will utilise the funds?
Yeah. I mean, that's not up for us to, I think, debate here. It needs serious discussion in democratic spaces or with people all around the world about institutions or organizations and processes that should collect, that should oversee, that can spend, that can eradicate our suffering. These have to be democratic organizations, which I don't think they exist yet.
No.
Okay, he's just responded. He said, I have used the idea of financial tax in response to those who say that the government has no money for reparations. However, I did not see FT as revolutionary or system change. The system will remain intact even with FT.
It may do. Yeah, don't have a crystal ball. But what we do know is that all our plunder relies on this system being intact. So if we were to think about how to interrupt that system, how to build public consciousness and raising awareness about it, this is a means to do that. To start having conversations and linking up the idea that slavery and colonialism morphed into something else. With people around the world, and even with people who call themselves progressive, and want to be our allies.
I guess I'm also thinking about this within the context of our own work around planet repairs, and the kind of transformative vision that we have of a repaired world, a multipolar, pluriversal world of global justice that we refer to as Ubuntusumakikigaidze, and certainly as African reparation is part of that, is a repaired Africa. And so when I hear you say that this tax really will be implemented by governments, I'm not looking at it in terms of governments that currently exist. I'm thinking about it in terms of what does this mean for the world that we are prefiguring, literally by our own actions within the international social movement for African reparations, and also the People's Reparations International Movement. And I'm thinking also about some of the ideas of people like Huey P. Newton around revolutionary intercommunalism, and the way in which the nature of the polycrisis means that, I mean, government, you know, it has to radically change and transform, especially when we're thinking about the crisis that's impacting on communities and the need for communities themselves to engage in transformative adaptation and not wait for governments.
No.
Yeah? So I kind of feel conflicted between the world that is, that we could easily say, yeah, attacks like this could happen if governments agreed to it, but again, that's, you know, who gives away their power voluntarily? Will governments do that? No. Will the financial industry sectors want to even this small amount of tax? No, they won't want to do it.
No.
So we, the people of the world, have to come with a revolutionary alternative that is going to have to contest that power that is being held over us and that power that we're being denied, to actually implement the kind of transformative changes that we need to see if we are to survive and actually thrive.
Yeah. I don't disagree with anything that you said.
Sorry.
I think following that, for me, the first question that needs to be raised and answered is, why not just, you know, wage a revolutionary struggle to overthrow capitalism? Right? Why do you have to be, you know, going via a tax which is within the parameters of the system and is subject to abuse? Because, you know, when you have the kind of governments that currently dominate, you know, the world, you know, which tend not to be accountable, you know, to people and are very repressive and corrupted, you know, and actually are committing mass genocide, you know, and ecocide even to exist, you know, and they just don't, they don't entertain any questioning of the way they are doing things.
No.
Okay. For example, I mean, business is seen of the business of, you know, looking for, I mean, taking over people's lands, right? Engaging in extractivism, you know, selling these things as cheap as possible, you know, on the world market, right? And raising the money and squandering it on ostentatious lifestyles, you know, and ignoring the needs of the essential needs of ordinary people is seen as the normal thing to do, right? You know, and it is not just in our parts of Africa or the, you know, so-called global south. Even here in this country, you know, ordinary people are sitting down, you know, for a system like this, you know, to exist, right? And when they had an opportunity to elect somebody, right, that wanted even some slight change, right? Now, you know, the very party that he was leading said, we don't want you to win this election. That's what happened to Jeremy. Labour lost the election because they didn't want, you know, their leader, that particular leader, to become the prime minister of this country. It was not the Conservatives who won the elections. It was Labour decided that with this leader, we must not win these elections. Okay, so I'm saying that here, where people are supposed to be, you know, more knowledgeable, right? The system is supposed to be more democratic. You know, the vast majority of people, you know, are still caught up, you know, with the system as it is. Okay.
Yeah.
So, how the question of governments pushing this, right, seems to, I mean, at least the kind of governments that dominate the world, seems to be a non-starter. Okay. Even with social democratic parties. Because the social democratic parties are the ones who are more hawkish today. Right? Including the Labour Party, including, you know, look around you, all the social democratic parties that have, they've all been for war. right? They all hold up this system. They don't want any alternative to it. So for me, that is why the question of, why this FTT as an attempt at the revolutionary use of reform becomes, something that we could raise and pursue now. And I think that I want to answer my own question. Right. It is precisely because there is still such backwardness in the mindset of people, particularly in the global north. And people are refusing to learn, and the example of, movements, including those that we participate in, like Extinction Rebellion, all these NGOs, right, testify to this. They know this and they are refusing, to educate people about it. They are refusing to have conversation about it because they are all part of the system. Okay? They are all part of the system, right? So, it will have to take massive educational effort, which unfortunately many of the groups on the left across the world today are not doing where it matters. Right? In my view, a lot of left, anti-capitalist minded people prefer to talk to themselves than to go out amongst ordinary people and engage in conversations with ordinary people, spend enough time with ordinary people where they are in order to even, earn the right to be considered as capable of having educational engagements with them. Right? Because when you meet me on the street with your, fight imperialism, fight racism newspaper, right? And or the socialist worker, this thing, or even a war, what is it called? War on Want or Global Justice Now flyer, right? I mean, first of all, Europeans don't have enough time to spend with people in quality conversations, right? You go to meetings about, we have 1 hour and we have to go through this, right? And when questions are, no, this is too complex, let's break it down. Which is unlike our kind of meetings, right? Where you go to a meeting and you might probably, finish at dawn, if you start the meeting. Because people want to properly understand, right? Want to understand, as we say, to understand even the issue, not just to understand it, right? But that's not how Europeans do the thing. And that is why the mindset, let's face it, the mindset of people in the global north is the problem. And passing through these institutions of miseducation is the problem. So somebody gets, even a first degree and he or she thinks that, he or she knows almost everything now. Now, when you come to get a PhD, it means that you are the god of knowledge, right? And ordinary people, their wisdom, from life, doesn't matter, right? Because you know everything and you ought to be teaching them. So for me, the problem is we now live in a world why the revolutionary use of reform becomes a necessity at this time is that we live in a world where people are being dumbed down mentally in schools, colleges, universities. They're not prepared to actually, be educated. They go there chasing certificates, to get out into the world and make money, right? So these schools, colleges, universities are not producing educated people. They are producing certified desk killers who are in a hurry to get into this system, and act in accordance with it, right? And so we have to be tactful enough to start from somewhere where at least, when you say a tax, right, a financial transactions tax, right? It's not too complex. But for me, it will only work if it is accompanied by systematic work to educate people. And to educate people where they are. And spend enough time educating people. Now, I'll end on that. Unless we do this, all these attempts to, force us into taking so-called radical actions on things, which is go out into the street, demonstrate, go and break a glass somewhere, get arrested, and so on. Now, people are not being encouraged to say, why are you doing this? What are you seeking to achieve? And these actions, what are they achieving? People are not being, including within Extinction Rebellion, to reflect on what is it that you are trying to achieve. What is the system, that you want to make effect, change?
Yeah.
Okay. And then we have nonsense like climate justice, right? Which thinks that on climate alone, you can have justice, right? And then on race alone, you can, as quite correctly said. And so these, even the language that is being used, is actually deliberately designed to fool people, right? And let them burn energy, on fruitless pursuits. And when you raise conversations around, and this is, let me why are we starting these conversations? Because in these spaces of these NGOs and these campaigning formations, any reasoning is a problem, right? There is hostility to the kind of reasonings that we are used to in our communities as tradition, right? There's absolute hostility to it. So until we get through this kind of attempts at focusing on FTT as a revolutionary use of reform, right? But to push further the necessity to find quality time and have proper, reasoning around issues and promote true education, we're not going to get anywhere. And that is why the danger is that if we just say FTT, well, it's another sexy, campaign to run, for NGOs, for campaigning formations, and then it gets aborted. But if so, we have to understand that if we do not get proper education to accompany this, and we break the Eurocentric mindset, which a lot of our young people also get used to. Oh, I just want a TikTok 1 minute. What are you going to understand with TikTok 1 minute? Now, you can provoke a conversation as a starting point. But if we encourage it, well, this is all that young people can take. This is all that people can take. So let's do everything in 1 minute. We're never going to get to the point where people have to use their brains for what it's meant for. Think, reason, and reflect even on your actions, so as to achieve purposes.
Thank you.
The first step for me is not about trying to convince governments of this. The first step is awareness, growing awareness with like-minded people around the world, making sure that they have we interacted and communicated with them so that we can understand their issues, their lands, their resources, and their bodies that are being plundered, and link it up to the financial system. Yeah, there's actually more political consciousness in the global south than in the global north because of propaganda that you were talking about. So, but for us, I think our job doesn't start by trying to convince anyone in the UK about this. Our first step has to be about spreading and speaking and interacting and learning from communities of resistance around the world. With the knowledge that we bring as living and working in the belly of the beast. And that's my humble contribution today, is having spent 15 years in the stock exchange and then coming through black Marxism, Pan-Africanism, the black radical tradition. What would those two look like if they met? And it's recognizing that this is becoming more and more popularized by the industrial NGO complex. So if we don't claim it, they will claim it. So let us claim it and have conversations with other like-minded people as a first step around the world. And I know it is a huge thing in some ways, to understanding the profundity of what I've tried to do today. But I've tried to distill it down into as least slides as possible. But I've just skimmed the surface. But don't let that intimidate you. You don't need an economics degree to understand exploitation. You don't. You don't need to see, you don't need an economics degree to understand why your wages are stolen from you around the world and how they're reflected in through share prices.
Okay, just to reply from Keval, financial tax is a viable tactic in our ongoing struggle for systemic change to bring about reparative justice. That was his response to the answer to his question. So he agrees with you.
Okay, good.
Because I think there's a difference, for example, in saying that we need to raise awareness about the nature of imperialism in the sense of how it operates through the commodity markets. I think that's definitely something that needs to be done anyway, and that's part of like the process of prayer, like part of the process of making people understand how the system essentially props up and continues the Manganese. But then I think it's a separate thing to then tag that onto the campaign for this financial tax, especially when we're kind of acknowledging that in terms of how it's practically going to become a reality, it's not really like, I think it's very unscientific in the sense that we kind of know that there's not going to be a progressive government that's going to put this through. If there was, they would be kind of like taken out. So realistically, because it isn't going to get implemented, it's not going to get legislated. And as I understand it, for it to be legislated, it needs to be legislated in the global north countries. So it needs to be legislated in the UK or the US. And the UK and the US, as a stronghold of imperialism, are never going to legislate a tax that will ultimately lead to their demise, especially if it's from the beginning they know what it's about. Like if we're saying, oh, this tax is going to end capitalism, they're not going to instate that. Like, and it doesn't really matter about, it doesn't really matter how many people we think. Yeah, how can I say this? I think, in the sense that, like, because as I understand it, the logic or the theory of change that you're proposing right now is that if we popularise it enough, this will create enough pressure on certain governments. But there's a kind of a bigger issue to popularise, which is essentially that the ongoing need for like self-determination for colonised communities, which doesn't have to take the form of this tax, and that's a lot more, and it is a complex financial instrument for people to grasp, because even though this is like laid out, you know, and explained clearly, not everyone's going to be able to get to grips with that, but people can get to grips with the fact that they're not free. And so is it not that we should focus on, and I think this kind of speaks to the kind of like atomization of struggles in a sense, because what does this campaign add to ongoing reparations organising right now, in the sense of how much energy is it going to distract from the ongoing demands and the ongoing campaigns we have now, e.g. like sort of the Manganese. So that's not really a question, it's more of a comment. But yeah, feel free to respond.
Yeah, no, it's really good. I don't disagree with anything that you said. Again, you know, we have enormous amount of work to do in, I think, popularizing this work, because it hasn't been popularized.
What has been popularized?
The extent to which the financial markets in this way create the conditions of our future exploitation at the value of $16 trillion per day, and that is what Western governments will use to legitimize future imperialism. Right?
I think you know, Tanita is asking. There is a question in what I've had, questioning what you've said, your comment, which is that, and I agree with that point, merely popularizing things doesn't mean that change will result.
No.
So if we were to now focus on popularizing the FTT, right, that would take us away from other things that we should focus on, like, for example, the fight for self-determination of colonized, peoples, right, through their communities of resistance. So, if we're going to focus on FTT, then it means that less time will be given, explaining and popularizing, the continuation of the struggle for national self-determination, right? So, that raises a problem of whether we should even be thinking about this at all, and why not just focus on popularizing our struggles for national self-determination? I think that is the question that I get. Am I correct?
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's
So our struggles for national self-determination,
we
could ask, how do we get that? And what systems and processes are in place to stop our determination for our right for self-independence? Like, they're not the atomized world of climate justice, Green New Deal, and BLM. It is a systemic issue, right? That comes from the legacy of slavery and colonialism.
All right, you said the belly of the beast.
The belly of the beast, the continuation of that through the same imperial core. So I'm struggling to understand how they're disconnected, in that for us to be free, how can we be free in a world that continues capitalism and imperialism?
Well,
Like,
no, I think in my view, the answer to the question that Tanita has raised is this: that when an oppressed nation thinks it has gained the right to national self-determination, and we've had it, take the fight in South Sudan that resulted, in the creation of South Sudan from Sudan. It hasn't changed, the conditions of the people. In fact, they've set up on each other, we heard about, there was a long, process of solidarity for East Timor, right? Now it's independent, there is a West Papua one, right? Now, if they were to gain national self-determination, right, they will be confronted by the lack of their ability to exercise that self-determination in the world as it is because of the existing, economic system.
Yeah.
So like Sudan, then they fall back, in an even weakened position, right? Because now, we can see very clearly, Western support for the South Sudan struggle, was simply to take the oil-rich part of Sudan away into the hands of a very disorganized movement, particularly after they decapitated the movement with its anti-imperialist leader, John Garang. Then now, the South Sudan government is just one of the worst neo-colonial regimes, you have on the continent, right? The same has happened. Look at what has happened in South Africa, right? With just the murder of somebody like Chris Hani, the ANC couldn't have, a leader capable of facing up imperialism. Look at Mozambique. the murder of Samora Machel, you know, saw the capitulation of Frelimo. You know, the death of Neto saw the capitulation of MPLA, right? And the murder of Cabral, you know, in Guinea-Bissau saw the capitulation of the PAIGC, right? You know, I mean, we have the example of Namibia, for example, with SWAPO in government, and you know, it doesn't have the balls, you know, to confront, you know, the legacy of apartheid. You know, so the reason is that they can't touch, they're afraid to touch the economic system.
That's right. Yeah.
You know, leaders like Nkrumah who confronted it and exposed it as heads of states, you know, with his neocolonialism, the last stage of it, which goes to the heart of, you know, the economy, the global economy with which, you know, so-called independent Ghana was caught, and that he couldn't really do much, you know, with Ghana, and said, well, we need to tackle this, you know, economic stranglehold. Right? That is the question. So national self-determination will become meaningless unless you are able to build a force capable of tackling the economy. And that is why people, you know, even revolutionaries, you know, governments in states like Cuba with Castro will be demanding, you know, this kind of tax. Because it does help them, you know, to ease the stranglehold of imperialism to some extent. And if all that the governments of the global south did, you know, was to demand and work for this tax. You know, no revolutionary demands, right? Don't go saying that you want to throw out US imperialism, you know, from your country, or you just say, you know, as it was possible for the Nanaline movement at some point in time to have done, to say, we want to enforce, you know, FTT. That, you know, reformist demand made seriously by the majority of states in this world will topple imperialism. That is a fact. Because there are certain demands, and this is why people need to understand the concept of the revolutionary use of reform, which was coined by Lenin, right? That, you know, sometimes people get so caught up on revolutionary slogans, and Lenin has something to say about the mouthing of revolutionary slogans, that revolutionary sloganizing can kill the revolution. Go and read Lenin, right? You know, the mouthing just revolutionary slogans can kill the actual revolution. And sometimes it takes revolutionaries, you know, making a reformist demand and organizing, you know, in revolutionary readiness to effect that reform to topple imperialism. Right? And a lot of that, you see, I think the major problem, and we have it in Extinction Rebellion, we have it in many, you know, organizations and movements right now, the lack of strategic thinking. It's a huge problem. People just are ignorant about strategy and tactics.
I think they confront the problem differently to us. That's why. If they see the problem as just more regulation on companies to minimize the extent to which they exploit us, they were like, oh, you know, we can go to government and ask them to take climate change seriously. Right? They have I think they set the problem up differently. And
sometimes honestly, and I will say this from my own experience of working within Extinction Rebellion, it's just plain counterinsurgency, right? Because when you say
Say it.
And I've heard it said many, many times in many, many places. Right? When you get
Speak your truth.
when you get in a group of idealistic change seekers, right? Pursuing a decoy set for them by the forces that they think they're up against, and they put all their energy and resources into that pursuit, right? They will never achieve change. And I've seen it in this country, right? I've seen a lot of people who come up, you see them, full of revolutionary militancy, who do this, do that, and they are pursuing something like anti-racist struggle. They go, they kill this person, they organize massive demonstration. They go kill another massive demonstration. And you're asking, where is the strategy? Where is the tactics? Where is this going? No. We have to mobilize people to have to protest, right? And then they do that for 1 year. They are completely paid out. And they say, no, this is not possible. We can't change anything. Next time you find them in tie and suit, working for the company.
Yeah.
Right? And that is a deliberate, tactic, of the enemy that just give them, and that's why the NGOs exist. Right? For an African, there is a particular Western NGO for your leg. There's another NGO for your arm. There's another NGO for your nose. There's another one for your, whatever. They all exist, right? And then you can be running in many, many directions. And a lot of actually good people who are well-intentioned, in Europe, Europeans who are well-intentioned, fall for this. Adopt a grandmother, adopt a grandfather, buy a goat, buy a fowl, and they're doing all this, right? And they think that, that because they've been told by this NGO that is the solution.
Yeah.
Right? And the religion, but for decades they're doing nothing is changing.
No. What do we have as a result? We have the rise of fascism.
Exactly. Just like, some tendencies in Extinction Rebellion are actually harbingers for ecofascism.
Yep.
By pursuing this nonsense of just doing something that is going nowhere. Yeah. But let's pour resources into it. Let's mobilize more people to go and do it. And these people are burning out. You don't have the capacity to defend them, when the system comes at them, and you also don't want to spend time even reflecting on your own, work, in order to think of what else can you do differently. No, just keep doing the same thing.
Yeah. Their lived experience, I think, prevents them from seeing the world as we've painted here.
No, but many, you see, I want to be honest here. I think counterinsurgency plants people within movements to keep insisting that you keep doing things that will make you burn out and go away. And how many people don't do that within, movements like Extinction Rebellion? They get burned out and they just disappear.
Yep.
And then new ones come,
Yep.
The same thing, they're opposed to a reflection of their own practice. The unexamined struggle is not worth waging. But some people within Extinction insist that you must not critically examine, what you're doing. And think differently. These are counterinsurgency plans. From my particular experience of working, the people who do that are counterinsurgency. They are paid to ensure that people keep repeating, the same thing and burn out and disappear. And the movement never grows, the movement never achieves anything.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody can fool me. I've spent decades on this, right? In different continents. It's a tried and tested counter-insurgency way of operating.
Yeah.
Burn people out.
And I think that in our movements, especially which are so transformatory, in terms of repair. You know, if we're talking really about systemic change, I don't feel in our movements we have enough discussions around the efforts that are being made to prevent us from reaching our goals. Because that's the moment that we're in right now. The counterinsurgency, the movement capture, the elite capture, and that's particularly happening around reparatory justice.
Absolutely,
So
absolutely.
the more, you know, we get lulled into a false sense of security because everyone's talking about reparations now, including the NGOs, politicians,
Including
governments, Extinction Rebellion. But why?
The Guardian
Why?
newspaper.
The heirs of slavery. Why do we see now the appearance of these types of groups?
So that
To
they can
once
hold the
again,
narrative.
Exactly. Steer the narrative.
Exactly.
Usurp control. Decapitate the leadership of the movements from below and impose an alternative neoliberal leadership that actually is just about reform.
Yeah, which the colonizers
it's
have been
about-
using for
it's
500
about
years. That strategy.
It's about there is a revolutionary use of reform. There is a reactionary use of reform.
Yeah, sure.
Colonizers have been doing the same thing to subvert uprisings, popular uprisings, for 500 years.
Yes.
Any country in the global south, you will see how they were working and funding both sides to create divisions.
That's right.
Yeah. How did they get India, which had enormously powerful armies and princes? You know, you pay both sides to go to war.
Esther, you don't go far. You take the Herero case.
Yeah.
You get them to fight within themselves.
Where is the chairperson who was the leader fighting for reparation justice? Today, he is on the other side with the government. So,
He's captured.
Well, I think that I always advise people read Reggie's Debris, Revolution in the Revolution. I'll never forget that quotation. That the counter-revolution seems to learn more from revolutions than the revolutionaries themselves, which means that yes, any revolutionary process, particularly one which has defeated them, like the Cuban Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, they will employ people from this Oxbridge, Harvard, Cornell, all these places, and pay them study every word that has been said or written by these revolutionaries. Study every action of theirs so that we can, counter it next time.
Yeah.
Right?
And at the same time, produce for one word that we've produced that's revolutionary and speaks from the heart of our injustice, they would flood the education system, the media, popular TV, radio with propaganda 1,000 times.
They're doing it with reparations, like they've done it with decolonization. And that is the standard thing. Like they're doing it with climate.
But they have endless funds for that because of the fiat economy. They can print money to create as much propaganda as they want.
So, we need to be mindful. Study.
So how do we counter that? Because that's a real issue. The point you've made, Keval, about there's endless resources to resource the counterinsurgency and the decoys, and the reactionary use of reform. How do grassroots movements from below who lack those resources, how are we best able to counter those very well-resourced strategies that are, countering what we are trying to do?
Just keep speaking our truth.
I don't think so. I think in part that's actually the issue. I think that the issue can't be, the answer to that can't be that we as global self-organized people do better at speaking our truth, because then who are we speaking to? Because if we're actually concerned that this system is learning from us faster than we're learning from ourselves and our communities, we can't just keep speaking our truth. The question is in what conditions, where, and how are we speaking our truth? And I think this is why Planet Repairs is a really significant step to making something like the FTT effective, because the question is, it was like there was a story you were telling me of the resistance to German imperialism,
Yeah.
where was it the women went first and they were dancing, and the men on the side of the cattle
Oh yeah.
ambushed the soldiers and then
Yeah.
took their uniforms. and
Like
everything.
when
But
why
the
don't
issue-
why don't we know about these women?
So this is the question, right? The question is, where do we speak our truth? And before that gets published in an Oxford journal of race studies or whatever new journal they're about to fund, we need to create the type of networks that are probably semi-clandestine or fully clandestine, where we're sharing that information. And I think Planet Repairs speaks to the need for us to create a decolonial language framework so that FTT can pop up in the right places at the right time and us know about it. And we can't be, I mean, I didn't know about Fidel Castro, advocating for it. But we have to translate this into the languages that are actually our own.
Yep.
And that's the next bit of work before we then take those into engaging with different groups.
Completely agree.
Working out how to do it.
Completely agree.
And that's the only way we can stay ahead of this thing, because, the way they can descend.
They can kill us, but they can't kill the ideas, right? How many times have we heard that expression?
And they should also stop killing us. We should make it not possible.
They won't,
for
because
them to kill us.
they got $16 trillion to make every day.
Exactly.
They won't.
They just
They
need
can
to send
easily
the
kill us.
drones. Let a little gnat, you wouldn't even know it's in the room. It can take you out, right?
yeah.
And with
At least-
AI
and if that-
capabilities as
And
well.
on the way home, if anything happens to me, here's hard copies of this presentation, yeah? You can take them.
I think let's not absolutize, the strength
Thank you.
of the enemy. I think that we can also you see, I think that the greatest weapon colonized people have against our colonizers is our humanity. It's our humanity. Right. All these AIs, the people who make them and use them are dehumanized. They are in disrepair, serious disrepair. Right? Anybody who works consistently, persistently against all the odds that come your way on reclaiming your humanity, you are far more powerful than any drone. You are far more powerful than any AI. Because, at the end of the day, as a human being, right, there is strength in humanism in a way that we underestimate. Okay? And, I mean, Osei Kwame Nkrumah said this, that, for us as Africans, our struggle for independence, for self-determination, should take us first and foremost, to recover our humanity, because that is the greatest gift we can, give, to the rest of the world. And I think, we very often are made to think, and that is really, particularly in dealing with whiteness, we are meant to think that we cannot do anything outside of whiteness. We cannot think and act outside of whiteness. Even when it comes to, transformation, revolutionary transformation, it can only be within the parameters of Eurocentrism, within whiteness. We dare not, rediscover ourselves. Very often, because we've been told we are primitive, we are backward, we lack history, we haven't achieved anything. But Fanon goes for that in the conclusion to The Wretched of the Earth. Leave Europe where they don't even know what human being is. Where everything they do is thinking about killing, human beings. Right? Let's leave that. Let's go back and rediscover our humanity. And that is the gift, that colonized peoples can give to people racialized as white. Our humanity. There is power in it. Right?
Some would argue that that's what got us into this mess in the first place.
That is what will get us out of it. Because we lost.
Because of our humanity.
No.
And judging others by our own standards of humanity.
Now we have known for over 500 years. Right. We have known. And we still learn it every day, even within the extinction, but we are learning it. Yeah. Where the dehumanization is and where the battles for humanity is. Right? We're learning it every day. You know. Because you see, it's not only AIs that are dehumanized. We have beings that look like us, that are completely dehumanized. And they don't blink to kill you because they just live death. All they know is death. This is what Fanon said. I mean, that's why the conclusion to the Wretched of the everybody should read it. Right? When you are a walking dead person, you are a danger not just to yourself, but to everything, that has life. And too many people have just been killed. They never at birth even, got humanized. And this is a reality we have to face. It's an occupational hazard for anybody who wants to change the world. And so that's the lesson, right? That we have learned, that you can be so human like our ancestors, and then you open up. But we've learned that on this planet there are people who look like us who are not human beings.
Yes.
So we can't just be opening up just like that to them.
Any more questions online?
Yeah, none on here. I was going to ask a question about what you think the FTT, what could be the relevance of the FTT now? I mean, you mentioned earlier about Petro and Ruto in Kenya, both talking now heavily about global finance and reform. How close is it to FTTs that we've outlined? What are the strengths and weaknesses of what they're trying to do on the global stage?
Yeah.
The stuff I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I was surprised as well when Petro and Ruto mentioned the financial transaction tax 2 weeks ago in Paris. I think what it shows is at least some understanding of the things that Castro was saying, 30 years ago. They're still relevant today. So at least they understand that globally, we are all under the force of global capital and global imperialism, and the power that holds over us is dominated in Western Europe and the US. So when Global South leaders, progressive ones anyway, want to talk about how to create a better planet, they are still, those two anyway, of the understanding that it's not a collective, it's a collective responsibility, but who has the bill for that? The bill is the people who enslaved and colonized. So it's positive, at least, that it's becoming popularized. The danger with it, as we talked about, is the extent to which it's going to become, like everything else, co-opted, diluted, watered down, owned by the NGO, the industrial NGO complex. That's the danger. And as a result, then you get to it being subverted and funded out of existence. And also creating a number of seriously academic articles, media targeting of anyone that talks about the FTT in the way that, not even in the way that I've described it. I've talked about the FTT in much more liberal and Eurocentric terms within the NGO space. And I've basically been offered no more work. They've just shown me the door. So not even talking about it in this way, I could, it's not for them. It's for us. So it's a good thing that they're talking about it, that Petro and Ruto are talking about it. And I think more leaders will start talking about it, especially in Latin America.
Yeah, but you see,
we have to control the narrative.
We've been here before, and my concern about this surfacing again is that lessons seem not to have been learnt about why it died away. Because the non-aligned movement which at some point dominated the United Nations and got some of these Western powers having to leave certain agencies of the United Nations, like, for example, UNESCO and so on. The demand for a new international economic order, a new international information order, these were very radical demands.
Absolutely, and it's the 50th anniversary in 2025.
Along these lines. But then, what many of them did not do was that they were shouting, about it, at this United Nations forum, right? In the midst of, in the glare of the mainstream media, okay? But their people knew nothing about it. They were not educated. They were not even organized, to expect the consequences of fighting for it. Unlike Cuba, which has gone through hell and is still going through hell, and many people are pretending that Cuba doesn't exist, or the Cuban people are not being, literally crucified, for, holding on to these ideas, and they can pretend that they want to change the world and not look in the direction of Cuba. Like many do in the Extinction Rebellion. The point is, you have to, this like Ruto, for example, who has a very difficult situation on his hand, and also Petro, right? Because Petro's coalition has collapsed. Right?
Already?
Yeah. The coalition which went into the elections has collapsed. Just on health reform. Okay. And Ruto is experiencing, problems, right? At home because of skyrocketing, prices and things like that. What they don't spend time doing, which is what the Cuban Revolution distinguishes itself in. One of the very first acts of the Cuban Revolution was the mass educational campaign. Universities, closed themselves and went into the countryside, to provide basic education to the population on the ABC of what the Cuban Revolution meant in terms of things like agrarian reform, and economic, changes and so on and so forth. When the U.S., left with everything and collapsed their economy, they went to educate people. And up till now, despite the decades of the blockade, the majority of Cuban people are at home suffering it, but holding on to their revolution. The danger is that we'll have a situation where Ruto is, blah, blah, blahing on international platforms and basking in this, media thing. Whereas the very people giving him media publicity, the same thing with Myanmar, are working hard to get them removed and killed. Right? And sometimes people, these leaders, mistake, the glare of the Western media as,
I've made it.
Yeah, exactly. You can be sure that when you start saying things like this, they already have a death squad.
Which is why it's not for them.
Right?
Yeah.
So, no, but it means that they need to be told this, and also because their own populations need to be educated about what does it mean when you have a government that is pushing for these things.
That's right.
Right? It might be, you may see it as, not good enough for you, but on the international level, this is a major system-wrecking demand. And they're going to come for that person.
How they might,
How
affect repercussions that will impact them as ordinary people,
Yeah, because sometimes
the cost of living, price of goods.
But sometimes, an uneducated population contributes to the overthrow of these kinds of governments. And sometimes also the extreme left, also contributes to this because they don't want to see, because they are like, big fishes in small ponds. They don't want to see the global picture,
Yeah.
Of how revolutionary this demand is.
Yep.
Right? So it that's why prayer is essential in something like this.
Yes.
The education and organization of your own people, to understand what this is all about.
Yep.
And the consequences of having a government that, a few governments that are now actively trying to win over other governments, particularly in the global south, to have the critical mass of governments, to make this possible, right? They will take them out one by one. And sometimes, like Sankara, they will take us out. Nkrumah, they will take us out. They took them out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They knew they'll come for them, they came for them, and that ended it.
Yeah.
So security is important, and that. These are the lessons from the Cuban and Vietnamese revolutions are immense.
Yeah.
Because why could they tried it, on Castro many times? It didn't work. Why? Because the people were prepared for that.
Yeah.
So the prela, in terms of, just for the benefit of obviously people who we have to keep on reminding. Interested in
It's
your
two
thoughts
things.
Should be
about
paid
that.
nothing.
It's two things for me. What strikes me is that,
These house Negroes should be paid nothing.
Okay.
like, it's obviously tokenistic,
Yeah.
like the amounts that they're talking about,
Yeah.
right? It is, and
Especially when we know how much gets traded on the
Every
markets
day.
Every day,
Yeah.
right?
it's not systemic,
Yeah.
right? And I think we have to keep reminding people that reparations is revolutionary.
Yeah.
It's a very simple thing. And if you are not dealing with the system and the mechanisms by which actually you can have a conversation about how to bring the system down through the FTT. And there's probably, and I'm not saying this is the only one, there's probably others. We just have to keep speaking about it in the way that you described earlier, and making sure that we're like talking about reparations from a systemic point of view, reminding people through this, if you want, it's not about a particular sum of money that then absolutely keeps the system intact.
Exactly.
They can print 100 trillion tomorrow, and what does that 100 trillion do? They're going to get that money back
That's why
through the global
CARICOM
south in plunder.
CARICOM is on a counter-insurgency mission to derail, our grassroots reparations.
Is it?
endeavors.
I mean, you can say that. I'm just questioning here because this is the kind of questioning that I get whenever I speak to people. Is it that they're on a counterinsurgency move, or is it that they just truly don't understand the system that we're dealing with?
Oh,
because
please.
many of no,
Please.
seriously, because many of them have been miseducated within these same classical models, right?
It's very interesting. Mia Motley's chief economic advisor, I've worked with him.
Yeah.
Esther, if
Wait, hold on. Let Keval finish. Go and then come back.
Where
Go on.
Just to let you know, everything's live at present.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's good.
I need to be careful.
Important conversation.
So Mia Motley's chief economic advisor is a former London banker called Avinash Prasad. Yeah,
Okay.
I can't remember if he's from Trinity or Barbados, I'm not sure. But of Indian descent, obviously, Prasad, right? Surname, I like that. And he worked on the Robin Hood tax for the Labour Party in 2016 and positioned the design of the first Labour FTT as a means to raise revenue from the system. So he called it raising revenue, enhancing resilience. So very much the framing of an FTT for the Labour Party at that time in 2017 as a mechanism by which the financial system could just avoid another crash. Yeah, and I spoke to him about, well, we can obviously ramp up the narrative. And I wrote the 2019 one for Labour using some of his text. And he was the one that actually presented my paper in Parliament in 2019 on behalf of the Labour Party. And I met him before we I finished writing my paper to kind of ask his views on things. And we met at one of his clubs that he's a member of. He's a multimillionaire. And he took us to a club round the back of the Royal Horse Guards Parade, where you have very exclusive clubs that you're a member of if you become a millionaire. And he very much is part of the establishment. He's an establishment figure. He's not a revolutionary. He's not an anti-capitalist. He's not an anti-imperialist. He's not even a Marxist or black Marxist. His analysis, I can guarantee you, is very much around maintaining capitalism, maintaining the system as it is, but trying to lower the harm that it does. He would not agree with me when I say capitalism is inherently racialized and it cannot be regulated, cannot be reformed. He would be like, well, Keval, you know what? It's very utopian of you saying that. I'm living in the here and now and present what colonized people tend to do, which is to say, I'm being unrealistic and I'm not dealing with the matter at hand, which is, people are suffering today. How are we going to help those people? And he would couch it in these terms. And he's all his economic thinking goes into me and Motley's position on this.
I think you see the challenge is really how do we critically engage with these people and call off their bluff. Right?
Do we have to?
No, we have to, because they influence.
But not initially, I think.
No, they influence a lot of people, right? And by challenging them and debating with them and exposing, with the lessons of history, right? Because this, for example, what CARICOM is doing is playing into the hands of fascism, puritanism.
Explain how.
Because CARICOM is making it as versus, European powers, right? Us versus them, right? Reparations in a truly African sense is about Ubuntu, right? It is, reclaiming our humanity so that everybody else can be human. It is repairing ourselves to catalyze, planet repairs, the repair of everybody, right? Reparations has never been to say that, I want, my pound of flesh. Because that is a disrepaired being. We have to be true to our values. Karenga and us talk about the ethics of reparations, right? We can only be truly talking about reparations where the entirety of humanity that comes from us as African people, comes on this journey with us and engages in repair, right? CARICOM is full of disrepaired monsters, right? And what they are doing, the end result, one, nobody is going to pay them a dime. These heirs of slavery who are counter-insurgency agents are misleading them. What is going to be the backlash? Fascism. The globalization of fascism is what CARICOM is doing. Because the ordinary people, including even people racialized as, non-white, in this, who is leading the government in this country? Right? What are they saying on reparations? Right? So if they persist, they don't have, first of all, they don't have the majority of their people behind them. They have not organized in any revolutionary way to effect anything. Can you imagine, they wouldn't even, Labour Party refused to get Kobina elected. Can you imagine somebody who is head of, a government in Britain waking up one day and saying that we're going to pay this trillions or whatever they are asking to this, idiots in the Caribbean, right? And you think that those who are threatening mutiny from the armed forces, if Jeremy Corbyn got elected, all these fascist gangs who would even march when young people within Extinction Rebellion went and wrote on Churchill this thing, this thing, they said they should hang them. They went to court. Adults went to court. Demanding that, teenagers who play pranks should be hanged. Right? And you think that somebody is going to head government in this country today and say that we are going to take millions from the coffers of this country to pay anybody.
Trillions.
The fascist armies will be out in the streets, and I will support them. Right? I will support them because that they are going to bring enormous bloodshed to us who live here. Right? We are the ones who are going to be sacrificed. They will be in their comfort in the holiday resorts of the Caribbean islands. Innocent, black people, innocent Africans will be slaughtered, like chicken, in the streets of London, in the streets of the United Kingdom. And that is why we have to be opposed to it. True African reparations, not the nonsense of a so-called Caribbean reparations that doesn't even deal with the indigenous people who've been slaughtered in the Caribbean.
Well, they will tell you their plan including to recognize.
I don't give a toss about it. The point is this. True African reparations is about all people sitting down to redistribute wealth. Right? That is what it is. And we will take our fair share by agreement. Okay? Because we will have organized and built our revolutionary forces to effect that. So we won't just be appearing there and begging and pleading. Right? But what CARICOM is trying to do is provoke fascism, and they won't pay the price. They will fly their children and wives who are here back to comfort zones, and ordinary, people will be slaughtered in this country. That is what will happen. We have to be opposed to it because that is not reparations. What they are demanding is not reparations. It's money into their pockets.
Well, they're saying, for development, they're conflating reparations with development.
Mobutu, listen, in
That's
Africa,
not being interrogated.
in Africa, listen, I listen to many people from the Caribbean who complain about the lifestyles of the elite, about the colorism, about the nonsense that they are doing, complete disregard for the vast majority of people in the Caribbean. I see that on social media every day. These people don't care two hoots about anybody. They're about lining their pockets. And this is what we should openly say. I don't have any... We need to tell British people, be opposed to any government that will come up to say that they're going to pay a dime to anybody, in this. I will be there. Because reparations is about us sitting as equals and talking about building a true commonwealth. Where we redistribute wealth. Where we learn to respect each other's humanity. And we as African people, we are about rehumanizing humanity. That is our ancestral mission. When we say Ma'at, when we say Ubuntu, that is what we mean. It's not asking for a pound of flesh. Because no amount of money is going to bring back today my ancestors who were lost. And if you don't care two hoots about them, they should go to hell.
Can you wanted to say something about Mobutu Seseko and then you jump to another point. Yeah.
Mobutu.
Oh, Mobutu, yes.
Yeah.
We've seen those people who say, they are even Africanists. Mobutu Seseko changed his name, right?
Fourth Burnham in Guyana.
Exactly. What crimes didn't they commit? How much didn't they line their pocket? The ones in the Caribbean are worse. Because they are liars. And they want to provoke a bloodbath, where innocent people in Europe will suffer.
This is where, for me, the dialogue becomes important because this perspective or interpretation of what many CARICOM officials are championing is not necessarily what you're going to hear, certainly not in the mass media, and not amongst many sort of African Caribbean reparationists, right? And in fact, many of them, especially the academic and political elites or predatory class, as others would say, would feel that what they're doing is far more quote-unquote diplomatic. It's not a politics of contention or contentious politics of movements from below. It is about diplomacy. Can we sit down? Britain, come and help clear up your mess. So this perspective you are sharing will not be seen by many of those who support those people and or who are complicit because they're just sitting down and letting a few people speak for the whole region.
I have a way to make it more understandable, which is actually to talk about the fascism being a response to a decline in the rate of profit, so that the elites ramp up terror to get the rate of profit back up again. Right, so I'll roll it back. Globally, global capital wants to return about 10 to 15% on what it pays out in mass projects, coal mines, investing in companies, vulture funds. Generally, you can see the rate of profit for 500 years being around 10 to 15%. Whenever there's a dip in the global rate of return, what happens is the finance sector lobbies the government to ramp up authoritarianism and fascism in order to subjugate and exploit the mass of the working population to return rates of profit. And that in itself is fascism.
Part of the projection you mentioned earlier, like the databases they have that projects things in the future or in their...
It's connected to share prices. Absolutely. So in the way that share prices, the valuation of share prices into the future determines the extent to which governments carry out the status quo, subjugating, exploiting, eroding wages, plundering the planet, climate change. All of that stuff goes into this economic modeling to create share prices. But on a global scale, the rise of authoritarianism that we see now, fascism that we see now, from my perspective, from my understanding of radical economic thinking, from a black perspective, comes from a decline in the rate of profit. So they're like, okay, fine. We're just going to ramp up fascism because we can, because we write the laws. So we're going to legalize fascism, and make the world worse. Absolutely, and which is why for me that's a key problem with singular demands for reparations and actually singular payouts. It's not systemic, but it also.
But it's not even reparatory.
It's not, I mean, all of the things Kofi was saying, all of those things, which is why for me the FTST sits at a systemic level. It's saying, as Fanon said, we don't want capitalism in the new world. We can do better than what the Europeans.
Exactly.
We can do better than what the Europeans have done.
We did better before.
Yeah. So the situation always has to be come back to what the NGOs don't want, which is a systemic solution. Right? Capitalism has to go, because in order for capitalism to function, it relies on fascistic imperialism to return those profits. And when there's a threat to those profits,
or malign.
Well, there's nothing benign.
No,
about
but in this way, people may not see that as fascism.
Yeah.
But we're all experiencing. Public sector workers in Barbados are experiencing that, right?
Esther, right? And if I was having an interesting conversation yesterday with Ollie, who started this thing about discussing fascism, and so fascism is here. Fascism never was defeated, right? Fascism just changed.
I would agree.
And it is true. The United States flew many of the fascists from Germany and repositioned them in, so-called South America, right? And even the U.S. to work for them. So that thinking within particularly the military-industrial complex is very fascistic.
And
that's never changed. So for me, and this is again George Jackson talking about fascism. The Panthers were discussing fascism in the United States, as something that they were confronting, and that is very true. We have, situations where then there are, more overt expressions of fascism. And that happens like in Chile when they came for Allende, right? Even in Ghana when they came for Nkrumah, right? When they removed Evo Morales, what happened, right? In Peru right now, what is happening, right? They have the fascist machinery in place in our various countries. If I tell you that what is happening on the ground under this government in Ghana today, what is more fascistic than that?
Yeah.
Right? So the point is, there is everyday fascism, which gets aggravated when profits, get reduced. And then they make war just like that. Right? Like Iraq, this whole big lie, Colin Powell stands before the United Nations, Tony Blair. These people have no, they can lie just like Boris Johnson about COVID. Just tell plain lies. And then lives get lost in very brutal ways. And this is why we cannot allow CARICOM. We cannot allow them. The blood that they are calling for of innocent people in Europe, who they have not consulted even the so-called Caribbean diaspora in Europe about what they're doing. They're hiding, negotiating, and people like, Bell is misusing the all-party parliamentary group on African Republic to back them up.
Yeah, that's what's happening.
Right? Because they're looking at their holidays in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
Right? As guests of these fraudulent governments.
Yeah.
Okay? So we ordinary Africans in Europe have to call them out. And we have to work with allies in Europe and say, this is not our reparations demand. This got nothing to do with us. And if we don't start that conversation now, innocent people will pay. The vast majority of people who are not part of this conversation, they are the ones they'll go for.
And I think the point that you're raising about the impact these demands are having on us here is really key, because we're often not seen, we're seen as really insignificant in the UK, actually, as diasporas. They always point to, if we're talking about African heritage diasporas, it's always North America, right?
Yeah.
It's seen as like the model African heritage community in terms of perception. But we are often totally ignored. And this point is just not overstood around what this means, because we are actually experiencing a rise in overt, direct fascism.
Yes.
Whereas in the 80s and 90s it got suppressed a bit and people felt, we had all these liberal regimes where there was recognition of our rights and so forth. That's all being rolled back. And it's being played out and met on the streets.
Yep.
Yeah, in the kind of little turf wars, what's happening with our young people, the fratricidal killings, which are, again, responses to that powerlessness. And that is not seen, and it's not recognised, and it's not factored in terms of what these people overseas in the Caribbean are doing, because they are disconnected from diaspora.
It's not because they are disconnected. They are complicit in this fascism, right? They've been miseducated to be puppets.
All of them have been miseducated here. In universities.
This is class struggle.
In the UK.
We have to understand it very, very clearly. These people don't care two who's
But how
about
often
you and
do
me.
African reparationists talk about class struggle in the context of CARICOM?
We have to.
Or the African Union?
We have to.
Or what's happening in Namibia or any other African government?
This is not about some Karl Marx or Frederick Engels teaching us anything. This is the lived experience of our people.
And the hostility that this class has towards the grassroots.
Because they are not, there's nothing,
hostility.
Because there's nothing about us. They are creations of whiteness. They are socially engineered creations of whiteness. They are dehumanized beings. And we have to work hard to see how many of them we can humanize so that they can come into the community of human beings. And we all work together for the redistribution of wealth. Right? That is what reparatory justice is all about. This idea, they are using white mindset, chasing money, right? And it's about lining their own pockets. And then the price is going to be paid by ordinary people in black again.
Yep.
Come on.
Yep. Cedric Robinson in Black Marxism talks about the inherent racialization of capitalism and how white working class communities are going to prioritize and privilege their own, and the formation of capital being on racialized lines.
Why would you blame them?
No.
Why would we sit down and say that because these people who care nothing about us, who live lives, that are obscenities and insults to the masses of our people in the Caribbean and across the world, they are now coming for our ancestral pots to get crumbs to continue living these, stupid lifestyles. And then our people will pay for it in black.
Yeah.
Right? Ordinary working class people, who are struggling with the cost of living in this country, right, are now going to get these idiots in the Caribbean come and take money.
Yeah.
To line their pockets and spend stupidly.
That's not going to happen anytime soon, as we know. And just
no, but they have the heirs of slavery, waving the carrots in their face, making them believe that it can happen. Right? And I'm saying that just that action alone will cost lives of our people in Europe. This nonsense that they're doing.
There is a very clear example of how fascism in India is causing lives to be lost here in the UK. We know Modi is a fascist dictator. And where does he come from? He comes from the neoliberalization of the Indian economy in 1991. Before then, a vast majority of Indian economy was nationalized, publicly owned by a centre-left or centre party Congress. After that, Congress, with World Bank and IMF blessing, privatized the majority of India's enormous state assets. And at the same time, Modi was the chief minister of Gujarat, overseeing a pogrom against Muslims, the genocide of Muslims. And talking about raping Muslims. His people are on panels, his party, the BJP party, are sharing panels with Hindu supremacists, talking about digging up the graves of Muslim women and raping them.
Oh my goodness. Sick.
But what's happened is that India, with Modi at the helm, doing this open fascism, is completely aligned with allowing global capital to come and invest in India. Yeah, they don't mind at all. Right? Before, when Modi was chief minister of Gujarat and this pogroms happened, he wasn't even allowed to travel to the US. And the UK, he had sanctions against him. But now as leader, with global capital being poured into India, because it's all privatized now, so the financing of all the industries, what we see here is coming through European banks, American banks into India, financing fascism, and this pitting of Hindus against Muslims, and as well as the Christians and low caste and uncaste people who are outcast. You're born into servitude. You're born to for example, clean sewers. And it's not like the class construct where you can actually
rise up.
Like if you are born as a sewer cleaner, that's it. Like you are demonized. But what's happened is last year there were riots in Leicester. Do you remember those riots in Leicester? Between Pakistan, originally from a cricket match, Pakistan and India. And then one side retaliated and the other time it got worse. But it has been exposed that the financing of that violence came via the BJP, which is only the political arm of a much more bigger paramilitary fascist organization that takes its instructions and its booklets and its manuals from Mussolini's black shirts and straight out Nazism.
Okay.
Yeah? The Hindu network community here in the UK was shown to finance and bankroll the Leicester violence.
Really?
Yeah. So the violence you see on the street in Leicester is causing people, is spilling the blood of people, working class children, kids, fighting, Muslims and Hindus fighting on the streets, being pawns to fascism in India and global capital.
Well, that's really interesting, that example, and I think we need to take note, especially in the Caribbean, and particularly I would say Barbados, because Barbados right now, to me, is also has opened its doors to global capital. And so that example you've given, I think we need to look at it in terms of the way in which Barbados is being propped up in a lot of the corporate media as this example that must be heralded and celebrated, but really what's behind that? What's behind that?
Yeah.
And this is what we need to do, the kind of geopolitical analysis and learning from our respective struggles around the nature of power and how it kind of metamorphosizes itself and can actually confuse us if we don't really have that correct analysis.
Yep.
But it's also important we go back and study, fascism. How it rose in Europe, and it's also again, resurgent, in Europe. And understand it's not a wide problem. Right? Because very often when you're saying these things, people think that, this is just a white problem. It's got nothing to do with us. Leave white people alone. It's just their problem. No. Right? The impact of even the Hitlerite fascism, on Africa, Asia, and Abiyala, is much bigger than the impact in Europe. Our people were forcibly conscripted, no questions asked, to come and fight these wars in Europe and met racism, in the trenches.
Yeah.
Right?
And make us believe we were noble by calling it world wars. But it wasn't a world war, it's a European war.
And when they went back, even the gratuities they promised, they refused to give them. And when they demanded it, they shot them and bombed them. Right? And this is what CARICOM wants to bring again. And people, come on, find the dead body of some of us. No way. We have to expose them because they are killers. They care for no human being. They are monsters. Because they will be sitting down with these very same, white big, tycoons on the holiday beaches while people are paying for their nonsense with their lives on the streets of Europe and in the homes. We are not going to have it.
It's why liberals are dangerous.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And they're liberals, right? I don't know who created this term, but I always like saying it. Scratch a liberal, a fascist bleeds. You might know who said that.
I don't really know. But I could find out.
But, and liberals could span like left to center.
Even Martin Luther King warned us against white liberals. Right? And you have lots of them in Extinction Rebellion. Yeah. And they don't understand the consequences for us. Of this bullshit.
Okay. So, for the sake of the recording, people might have energies to go for a lot longer.
No.
I just want to bring it back to you to sort of summarize and conclude out. But thank you for there's no more questions, but thank you for the discussion. But to summarize the talk, so that we can end it here for now and continue the discussion later.
Okay. Well, firstly, thank you all for listening to me. This is just my humble contribution of having worked in the city for 15 years and engaging with liberal politics and stepping out of that and engaging with radical politics from across the global south and trying to make sense of the world that we live in and saying at a systemic level, what can we do to overthrow capitalism and imperialism? Why? For reparative justice and system change. It is, in my view, capitalism and imperialism that creates the conditions of racism and fascism and climate change, the unavoidable consequences of the system. For me, the financial transactions tax that really incorporates the totality of the system that was left behind by slavery and colonialism, that the entirety of the system that was left behind can be valued at a systemic level. It's roughly $16 trillion per day that authoritarian governments have around our necks. And that gives them the incentive to make sure that the laws and policies and our education system and everything that they own, all of their state apparatus, including the military, goes towards propping up and making sure that in the future that money comes back to the system. So if we want to emancipate and liberate ourselves, for me, it has to come with dismantling capitalism and imperialism. And I think the financial transaction tax, from all of the policies that I've come across, is the most systemic way to do that, and is the thread that I think joins a lot of our struggles, even outside of the reparations movements.
All right, thank you very much. So that concludes the very first Ubuntusumakikigaidze session at Ghoppis. Thank you, Keval Bharadia, for your contribution. We'll be sharing this online, and we can look out for more. So.
And then there is a follow-up action, because this is not just talk. Yeah, no, I think there are follow-up actions. How do we do the work that's been, actually outlined here, which is the grassroots mass educational work and organization, making it relevant to our, colonized people's, struggle for national self-determination. I think it's key, because otherwise it won't be understood, our people, so the relevance of this as a key policy, struggle for national self-determination, needs to be highlighted. And that's the work we have to do. Prela is very, very relevant, to this. So, yeah. Thank you, Keval.
Education is preparation for reparations.